Greetings all and welcome to Daily Pali Reading. Today we are going to begin going through the Metta Sutta, the Buddha's words on loving kindness. It is Sutta 9 in the Khuddaka, which is found in the Khuddaka Nikaya, the kind of last collection of the Sutta Pitaka. It's a collection that contains many various shorter works, such as the Dhammapada, the Therigatha, the Theragatha, the Udana, the Itivuttaka, and, at least in the Burmese edition, it contains the Milinda Panyo. So I think this is a good place for us to begin our Pali journey, because I think this is one of the best places that we can start or begin our Buddhist journey. And if we haven't started in upon the Metta Sutta, there's no better time than now. Practicing loving kindness, practicing metta is something that is actually very enjoyable. It has a parallel in, say, the Bhakti Sutras of Narada. And actually Narada claims that that's the easiest spiritual path, the spiritual path of devotion, of love. So we will begin with just this first little bit of text here. That is the text that goes up until the comma. Karaniam atta kusalena. Now this text actually divides into two words, which really will divide into three words, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. If we take this first part, karaniam, now let's say we don't know what the form of this word is. It just doesn't look familiar to us whatsoever. If you go to the Pali English Dictionary and look it up, you will actually find an entry for karaniya. And it is listed as the gerund of karoti. Now, I would say that it's more likely to be described as a future passive participle. And future passive participles carry with them this idea of obligation. But as I said, we may not know that. If we look up this word, we will find that its first definition is that ought to be, must, or should be done. To be done, to be made. So the definition here actually tells us that meaning. But we should familiarize ourselves with this ending, because I don't think it's listed in every case. One thing, this isn't the most common way to form the future passive participle, which is usually, I think, more commonly encountered as tabba. And that might be why the Pali English Dictionary is listing this. But if you look up in Duroisel section 469, it talks a little bit about aniya. So what is happening here, if we just kind of go through the steps, we have this root, kur. Now that root can undergo what's called strengthening, and it would become kar, to which this suffix is added. Now since it's a participle, it gets declined, and that means it will be either masculine, feminine, or neuter, and it will be in one of the 7 cases. And 7 cases because I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that it's probably never found in the vocative. Now, knowing that, we need to sort of parse this word and see if we can figure out its gender and its case. And I would suggest that it is neuter nominative singular. Neuter nominative singulars are going to end in ung, and that's what we would have if this word weren't followed by a vowel. So if it's neuter nominative singular, it's going to mean something along the lines of it should be done. That it part isn't explicitly stated here. Just as if we had the verb karoti, it's built into the verb he, she, or it is doing. So we might even have to supply something like this should be done. Now really, the it part is going to be the rest of this sutta. This sutta is setting forth what should be done. So we'll move on to this next part, atta kusalena. Now this conglomeration of words can further be divided into atta and kusalena. And we'll do that, we'll kind of show that by putting a hyphen here. Now this is a specific type of compound called a tapurissa, and it's actually also a bahubihi, we'll come back to that in a little bit. When I first encountered all of the taxonomy of compounds, it really sort of put me off, and I didn't quite grasp the necessity of understanding compounds that way. So first, why don't we just look at the words, and then we'll talk about why it's kind of important to understand the type of compound it is. And it may be that it's very evident, and that might even help us. And by the way, if it wasn't obvious to you that this word breaks into atta and kusalena, you can try looking it up various ways. If you go to the Pali English Dictionary, the online, and you start to put in atta, and you put a K-U, you will end up with no suggestions. If you get to attaka, that could be a word, and you might think that that could be what this is, and maybe that something's been elided because of this U. But when we look up compounds, we just always have to be a little nimble, and we have to be flexible. And if we look up atta, we will actually find that that's a word. And then that would leave us just with kusalena. Now, something about kusalena, and we'll mark this ending part here, we have to know also that kusalena is not the actual dictionary form of the word. And again, one nice thing about using, say, the digital version of the Pali English Dictionary is that if you look that up, if we were convinced that it's kusalena, when we put in kusale, we have no recommendation. So we know that that is not that's not going to be a dictionary entry. What we need to do is recognize that ana is the masculine instrumental singular ending of the declension. So we can look up kusala, and we should find that that has an entry, and it does, and it has a long entry. Now, this is one word that we should acquaint ourselves with in our Buddhist practice. No matter the level of Pali we want to attain, kusala is one of these words that the Buddha uses quite a bit. It can mean wholesome and skillful. It has quite a list of meanings. And if you're reading a translation, even in Mahayana, when someone's talking about skillful means, you can bet that the word kusala was involved at some point. Now, with compounds, it's best if we start with the last word in the compound, and then we can work backwards, so to speak, from there. So we have this kusalena, which we now know is kusala. And this is really an adjective. That's what turns this into a bahubihi compound. This compound is pointing towards something or someone else, in this case, a someone else. So kusala means someone who is skillful. Let's take that meaning. So in the instrumental, it's going to mean by someone who is skillful. And if we go back here to karaniam, we will remember that it's passive. So this should be done. And when we have something, when we have a passive construction like that, we will, if there's an agent expressed, it will be put in the instrumental case, which is what we have here. So it should be done, this should be done by one who is skillful, and then we can work backwards to this next part, atta. Now, atta also has quite a range of meanings, and one of those meanings is meaning. You will find that in the commentaries, especially when they talk about this is the meaning of a certain phrase, atto. But in this case, it's probably going to mean something like profit, what's morally good, blessing, welfare. Now, this is a point about translation. When we commit to an actual translation, we kind of have to settle on one word. Unfortunately, this word has a range of meanings. So keep in mind, our real goal here isn't to make the best translation. It's to understand the Pali. So we can note that it has this range of meanings. When we tell someone what we think this means, we can elaborate. That would probably always be the best way. It's not as readable, but you can footnote these things or just kind of expand them when we're talking to people or talking to ourselves about what we think the meaning is. So now we need to determine the relationship between these two words. Kusalena, by one who is skillful. And then we have this word, profit, blessing, welfare. And sometimes with compounds, especially these tapurisa compounds, we might have to insert some other word that makes it make sense. So in this case, by one who is skillful at knowing, who is skilled at knowing what is morally good, what is a blessing, what is advantageous. And I think we could even, and it's a little bit funny, but we could say something like, by one who is good at knowing the good. To a certain extent, that captures the meaning here. But if we're trying to just understand the meaning and not translate it in a very concise way, what we can notice is that the Buddha is telling us that what follows is something that should be done by the person who knows that something should be done. In other words, the spiritual aspirant, the adept, the person who's understood that the present normal way of living life is not adequate to overcome suffering.